Today I canned pot roast. You can use this video as a general guide on canning roast, but before you can anything, be sure to educate yourself about proper canning procedures. I usually recommend the Ball Blue book because it's cheap and easily found. However, when it comes to canning roast, I believe the Ball people really miss the mark. What they advise to do to roast is to cut them into 1-inch strips the length of a jar across the grain. Now, I don't know about you, but when I want a can of roast, I want a large piece of meat. And I asked why. I wondered if there was a density issue with canning large pieces of meat, but when you look, the Ball people say it's okay to can whole pieces of chicken even with the bone in them, and they also say it's okay to can whole pieces of rabbit even with the bone in them. So I assume from that density is not an issue. Now, I don't like to can based on assumptions, so I kept looking for instructions for canning large pieces of meat. The USDA canning guide doesn't give specific instructions on canning large pieces of meat. However, they do have a chart that lists processing times for cubes, strips, or chunks. So I asked, okay, well, what's a chunk? That must be a large piece of meat. I have an old cookbook that says to can roast by cutting the meat into 1-pound size pieces, brown them, then trim to fit the size of the jar. That's the most specific information I've been able to find on canning roast. I also found a book called Putting Food By, and on page 158 they say, and I quote, "Prime cuts of beef, pork, lamb, veal, and large game are best canned in large pieces. The less choice parts are good for stews and ground meats." Unquote. So based on that information, I can roast in large pieces. However, you need to do your own homework and decide these things for yourself. Another thing that I found odd about the Ball instructions was the fact that they said to cut strips of meat across the grain. Now, I thought if you do that, then the strips will fall apart once they're canned. And according to the Canning for Dummies book, they advise to cut strips of meat with the grain or else they will fall apart. So, like I said, the Ball book it didn't make sense to me. That's why I don't follow those instructions. On a side note, when it comes to canning raw meats, there is a discrepancy between the Ball book and the USDA canning guide. The Ball book says to add water. The USDA canning guide says don't. So when it comes to canning things, some things are going to be left to your discretion, and you're just going to have to decide for yourself what's right and what's not. And I'm not an expert by any means. Just like the rest of you, I have to sit and use common sense to figure out what is the right thing to do and proceed accordingly. When you're canning, some foods do have density issues. The food can be so dense that the heat won't penetrate to the center of the jar. One food that is famous for that is pureed pumpkin. They advise to never can pureed pumpkin because of the density issue. And in the book, Putting Food By, on page 46, and I'm quoting, "Raw meat, ground fine, and packed without liquid offers the same sort of problem." Unquote. Now, if canning large pieces of meat was a density issue, I'm sure that this book would point it out, because they certainly pointed the problem out when it comes to raw meat ground fine. They also point out that shrimp has density issues and shouldn't be canned in anything larger than a pint jar because of that reason. Incidentally, I have canned shrimp in the past, and it turns out excellent. I will say that canning the roast in large pieces wastes a lot of space inside the jar. That if you cut the meat into 1-inch strips. It would be a more efficient use of the inside of that jar. Now, having said all of that, this is how I can roast based on the information that I found. But like I said, you need to do your own homework and make these type of decisions for yourself. Please don't trust the word of a stranger on the internet, not even mine. Go out and try to find these things in writing. And I don't trust information I found on the internet because wrong information can get spread very easily and be turned around so that it looks like it's the proper thing to do when it's not. So try to find it in a book in writing. I like to use sirloin tip. I found this on sale for $2.48 a pound. I trimmed the excess fat from the meat, then cut it up into large pieces. I cut these a little smaller than I normally do so that I wouldn't waste so much space inside the jar. I browned the meat on a griddle, then I put the meat pieces in a large roasting pan. I pour water on the griddle to clean it off and save those juices and add them to the roasting pan as well. When all of the meat has been browned, I add water to the roasting pan so that I'll have more broth. I put the meat in the oven and bake it at 350 degrees until the meat is medium done. The next thing I do is get my jars, lids, and rings hot and ready. The reason I use hot jars is 1, because every canning book says to use hot jars, and 2, because I found that it increases the chances of all of the jars sealing. I bet you're also wondering why I'm not just canning this meat raw, and that's because of the appearance of the meat once it's canned. I not only want it to look appetizing, but I also view it as a safety measure, and I want to be able to keep that meat underwater. Now, when I'm canning, I like to keep my food underwater, especially when it comes to beef, because in time, the meat that is above the water level will turn very dark, and the fat will be sitting up there and get dry, and the fat will start to look just like mold. Now, if the meat was canned properly, it's most likely safe to eat. However, if the food looks rotten when it's not, how will you know when it's rotten when it is? One of the indications of spoiled food is the way it looks. If you can it in a way that it's not going to look right, then you're throwing one of your safety precautions out the window. I just don't want to do that. Over the years, I've only had one jar of meat go bad on me, and it was a jar of chicken, and I knew it by the way that it looked. Believe it or not, the lid was still pressed down, and but when I tried to lift the jar by the lid, it came off easily. So if you think that that lid is going to blow off of there when the meat goes bad, it may not happen. You may eat that can of food at a point just before the lid comes off. Now, I'm not a canning expert by any means. I've done a lot of canning over the years, and I've been in a hurry and done things that I shouldn't have done, and that's how I know the difference between what turns out the best and what doesn't. And I know a lot of people out there in a panic these days to get as much food put away as they can, as fast and as easy as they can, but, if you're putting up, say, a year's worth of food, any mistakes you made, you're going to have to live with for an entire year while you're eating that food. So I really want to try to show people the best way to do this so that you won't have to live with your mistakes for such a long time. So back to the canning. I take a hot jar and fill it with hot meat. You may have to put the meat in and then eyeball it to see what size the meat needs to be, and then take it out, trim it, and put it back into the jar. Then I add a teaspoon of salt. Now when you're canning meat or vegetables, salt is not required. It is only a matter of taste. Then I cover the meat with hot broth. Since enough broth to do the canning won't fit in the roasting pan, I also have a pot of boiling water on the stove, and I'll put about half boiling water, half broth from the pan into the jar. Get the air bubbles out with a non-metallic object. Then I clean the rim of the jar, add a hot lid and a hot ring, tighten it down, and put the jar into the pot to keep warm until I have filled all of the jars. At that point, I take all of the jars, put them into my pressure canner, and follow the manufacturer's directions for the pressure canner, because canners can be different. I process the quarts for 90 minutes at 10 pounds pressure for my area. When the canning is complete, I turn off the heat and let the canner cool down for at least 30 minutes. Then I carefully remove the jars from the canner, put them on the counter on a towel to cool. It's not unusual for the jars to continue to boil for an hour or more, sitting there on the counter. When the lids pop and the button on the top pulls downward, then you know that the jars have sealed. I let the jars sit for at least 24 hours, and then I remove the rings, wash the jars, write roast on the top, and the date that I canned them. So that's how I can roast. Like I said, use your own judgment with this one, and try to keep yourself safe. And I'm sorry again about this video running so long, but I hope it helps.